it goes back quite a ways. And we know this through archaeological research, which has been ongoing. And since I would say the discovery of this site in the 1870s, a number of interested parties recognized the prehistoric mine pits that were dotted across this landscape, and started taking interest in that and reviewing it, applying scientific methodology to documentation of those features. But since then, especially with the advent of radiocarbon technologies, we've been able to date the site to no less than 4,500 years before today. And that particular piece of radiocarbon comes from the very bottom of one of those pre-contact mining pits. And that was performed in the 1960s by some researchers from the University of Michigan. That's a piece of charcoal from the bottom of the pit, that could have rolled in many years after the pit was abandoned. So we say no less than 4,500 years, but we suspect much earlier. More recently, some researchers from University of Pittsburgh and University of Minnesota Duluth have been doing some sediment coring analyses in McCargo Cove, which is adjacent to this mining landscape. And what they're learning is they're seeing interesting spikes in particulates that are washing into the watershed, from the Minong Mine landscape. There's a natural baseline of particulates, but then when you expose bedrock and open up the elements and you allow water to kind of course through those surfaces, that eventually brings a higher volume of particulates, all very minor in a big scale, but but when you bear down into the detail, you can see these spikes above baseline, and their carbon dating suggests that those spikes occurred as early as 6,500 years ago. And so that's a big time gap between 4,500 and 6,500 years, and it's a big question mark in terms of the possibilities that are out there. So the age of this mine is ancient. It goes back quite a ways, and it's extremely significant when you look at that 6,500-year-old date. You're getting into the beginnings of people and culture using metals as part of their toolkit. And that could very well have happened here in North America, here in the Copper Country area. So that's pretty interesting. For those who've been to the island, it's I would say north central portion of the island. There's a really interesting geologic fault, which is now McCargo Cove, which penetrates about 2 miles inland from the island's north shore. And at the very bottom of that cove, at the south end of the head of the cove, is where this mining landscape is located. It's along the Minong Ridge, which is part of our trail network. And so there's a campground there at the head of McCargo Cove, which is a frequent stop for park visitors and boaters. And so you can hike along this trail, and there's a little spur trail that takes you down into portions of the mining landscape. And historic mining, I should add, occurred here beginning in the 1870s at this particular location. And so one of the main points of interest at the head of this National Historic Landmark designation and evaluation is we are interested. We'd always heard stories about there being thousands and thousands of these indigenous mining pits, and well, let's see if that's actually true. And we learned that there are at least 600 plus mining pits across that landscape, but we're also interested in the impacts that the historic and mining might have had on that landscape. And this is the historic copper mining era that we're all familiar with, from the Keweenaw area and the Ontonagon area. But we learned that impact was a smaller portion of the greater whole. And so there's large acreages of these indigenous mining pits that are left intact and preserved as they were left and abandoned. Especially with that sediment coring date in mind, with that big gap of 2,000 years between, the earlier radiocarbon sample from 1960s, research is ongoing. And, those little chunks of radiocarbon, charcoal that were pulled from the bottom of those mining pits in the 1960s by the University of Michigan researchers, there's only a few of them, and there's literally 600, plus pits out there. So there's a lot of potential for research on this landscape. And there's a lot of interesting, stories and takeaways and uh, about the nexus of the indigenous mining and how that preceded the historic mining and how the two are sort of commingled. This was a time when people, especially the mining companies, at least in the early, ages of the mining up here, were looking at those clues left by indigenous miners as places where they could themselves situate their mining operations. And so you have that, the mine managers at the time were, intimately involved in the placement of their mines, of course, but they were definitely keeping a sharp eye, out for those earlier mining features. And so, yeah, the research, opportunities are boundless. We work with, we've been doing archaeological research that's adjacent, to the mining landscape. We're interested in what the mining was, of course, and who did the mining, but we're also interested in what happened at the end of the day. Where did the miners go? Where did they process their tools? Did they have sort of preliminary processing areas that you would think would be closer to the mine itself? But eventually they got to migrate to other resources such as fish, and they got to feed themselves, and that might be McCargo Cove or points elsewhere. And so there's all these adjacent peripheral stories that also relate to the mining. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to follow and research. Those distinctions are reserved for true exemplars of a particular site or feature or architectural structure. We're all familiar with those designations, which would be those bronze plaques inside the buildings, in downtown Chicago or wherever. Archaeological NHL designations are less frequent. But what we're celebrating with this nomination is that, a very unique indigenous mining history occurred in this copper country region that we know. A lot of that has, a lot of those sort of places have, seen subsequent mining and by default obliteration. And so those resources have waned quite a bit. And this location on Isle Royale, under national park protection, is a true exemplar of this particular archaeological history. This mining history, which is so unique to our region and to the nation. Copper mining has everything to do with a lot of the towns and cities that we see across this landscape. But it also had everything to do with the migrations and wanderings of indigenous cultures long, long time ago. And so that same resource, copper, was attractive to many people for quite a few millennia. So yes, it's a celebration of a unique site, and it's unique on Isle Royale, but it's also unique in our region, and it's essentially like the flagship of this particular type of resource. You can think of, most of the historic mines, the Delawares, the Cliffs, the work up near Copper Harbor and down towards Okanagan. A lot of those places or those mining operations were situated on pre-contact mining endeavors. Indigenous mining endeavors, I should say. And what happened is, for the most part, they've been obliterated by those mining, because mining happened on the island, but it just stopped as soon as it started. And you never had another company come in at a later date and pick up where the other ones left off. And there's a number of reasons that we don't need to get in the weeds on for that in comparison to the mainland. But those operations, definitely chewed up and consumed those really interesting resources. And so there are definitely a few examples that still exist, here on the mainland, but not like they used to be, and not as suggested as you see in some of those old maps from the 1840s that place those indigenous copper workings, across that expanse of the Keweenaw down towards Ontonagon. And I should add too that, a lot of those same resources have been impacted by more recent, looting events. People who are out there hunting curiosities such as copper artifacts, they do have impact on those, scant resources that do remain. And that's something that we're very mindful of. And thankfully we are a national park, and and those resources are protected under federal laws. And so, and that's part of one of my job is to steward and preserve these very sites and features because they are so special within a national park setting. But yeah, there are some features like that elsewhere in the mainland, but you absolutely do not see the same integrity and preservation as you do on Isle Royale. We do have a few interesting websites devoted to the indigenous mining that occurred here, as well as the historic mining, as well as any number of other histories that are people find interesting on the island, be it lighthouses, shipwrecks, summer cottages, fisheries. But yes, you can learn more about the National Historic Landmark designation. We're updating things as we speak, so it may not be as fresh and current as this release right here. But yeah, we do intend to, offer more than what we already have out there. But I think what's up right now will be interesting enough, and we look forward to putting more up. The site is best accessed from McCargo Cove. And so, you get to McCargo Cove from hiking from one of our main visitor centers at Wendigo or Rock Harbor, or you can boat there. And there's a easily followed trail up from the campground. And then there's a spur trail that takes you down into the historic mining landscape. And that's probably the best place to really kind of see and enjoy the landscape for what it is. There's a lot of things that are, quite evident on the landscape, and you really kind of immerse yourself in the mining experience there. At some point, we hope to, offer some presentations and have some researchers present on this nomination, the process, and of course the resource. I think we'll wait for a time when I should say everybody's vaccinated. So here's hoping for that in the coming future and years. But we look forward to mentoring and stewarding this new National Historic Landmark designation and keep the community apprised of ongoing archaeological research.